Hello everybody, happy Thursday. How are you today? I'm coming in with this week's midweek message to talk to you about anxiety, depression, the mind and happiness. And I wanted to share this with you because I remember a time back in 2016 that I had been diagnosed with PTSD, clinical depression, insomnia and eating disorders. So a whole host, a smorgasbord, if you like, of mental health issues. And when I was given that diagnosis, I didn't really understand what each of those things meant. I was offered drugs, support, a variety of different things to help me on a medical level. But I decided that I wanted to help myself on a holistic level using health, nutrition, lifestyle and holistic matters in order to really heal myself back to happiness, which actually was the name of my first business. And sorry, I think I've got soup around my mouth, my lunch. Probably means I've got kale in my teeth too. So I wanted to use these like holistic methods. I've been doing a lot of research and understanding about the mind because my mum had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's 10 years previously. So I had a real interest in the mind and in the brain. So then being given a whole host of diagnoses that included the brain, I felt like I really wanted to work on this myself. And one of the things that really helped me when I started to dive into my understanding of what anxiety was and what depression was and how my mind was working was a wonderful image that I saw on a feed with Eckhart Tolle. I was reading his book called The Power of Now, which if you haven't read it and you are somebody who struggles with depression and anxiety, I would urge you to dive into it. It is quite a mind-blowing book, and I had to read it piece by piece, and I had to decipher it almost paragraph to paragraph to go, oh my goodness, this is a whole new way of thinking, a whole new way of understanding and looking at the world. But one of the images that came with one of his passages really helped me understand the difference between anxiety and the difference between depression. And then from understanding that, I was able to understand how I could create a path back to feeling good, back to feeling happy, because that's ultimately what I decided I wanted to be. Even though I've been given these diagnoses, I wanted to be happy again. My natural state is happiness. It was happiness. And I just had a whole load of situations that almost robbed me of my happiness. And I wanted to be able to not necessarily go back to that level of happiness, but be able to create it again. And this image that I keep referring to really helped me understand those two differences. And it was like this little ant sat in the middle. So it was like almost like that was me in the middle. And then anxiety was explained, and actually I'm going to start with depression. Depression was explained by this little ant or this little human being underneath a whole pile of rocks. And these rocks that this person, me, was carrying had labels on such as guilt, regret, sadness, bitterness, not forgiving. This whole idea that there was too much past. I was carrying too much of my past, and that was making me feel really heavy. Like I was under the weight of all of these burdens of grief, of bitterness, resentment, all of this sadness. I was holding on to it. I was choosing to hold on to all of these feelings, and that was what was weighing me down. And when I thought about it, depression and that depression that I was in felt like a huge, heavy rain cloud, just so heavy. Like the story I did yesterday to introduce today. It was like huge, heavy rain clouds, grey, dark, bleak, stuck in mud, unable to move because the weight of my past was just keeping me where I was. I was like, well, now that's interesting. That is interesting. And then when I looked at the other side of this image, there was another version of me, or this ant, that was depicted in this picture. And above it, there were also a whole load of rocks. But on these rocks that described anxiety were all future related. So while depression was almost like living too much in the past, anxiety was all about living too much in the future. All of the fears that come with the unknown of what is going to happen, the tension, the stress, the overwhelm of possibility, this unease of unknown, because we don't like to not know what's going to be going on. And where I was at the time, my future, I had thought, was almost like I knew what was going to happen. I had 2 children, a marriage, a lovely home. I was growing a business at the time in health and wellness, and I kind of almost could see my future mapped out with continuing on, looking after my children, going to school, growing my business, writing a book. I was writing a blog at the time. Everything almost like seemed mapped out. The children would go to this school, then they would go to this university, we would grow old, we'd go on a cruise, and then I would die a happy woman. But in one fell swoop, everything got obliterated and I had no future. And that was causing me so much fear, so much overwhelm from the possibility of what am I going to do, and what if nothing works out, and what if I'm never going to be happy again. All of this kind of like unease, of uncertainty, of panic that was in my body because I was living too much in the future, of a future that I couldn't see, that was too much unknown. So in understanding these 2 differences of what depression was and what anxiety was, that depression was I was holding on to too much in the past that was giving me these really heavy feelings, this rain cloud, and living too much in the future of trying to understand what was going to happen and that I couldn't see it. It was almost like, rather than being under a rain cloud, it was like I was living in this like tangled mess that I just couldn't understand, and it was just chaos and loud and noisy and frightening to be in my head. Oh, somebody just tried to call me. So this visual hugely helped me. So how was I going to help myself with the depression, and how was I going to help myself with the anxiety? And what Eckhart Tolle always talks about is like the power of now. When you're living too much in the past, when you're living too much in the future, you bring yourself into this present moment. But how? How did you do that? So I made it my work at the time to go away and have a look at this. And I wanted to share some of the things with you that I found out that really helped me move back into the moment to find happiness. Ultimately cure myself of my diagnosis of clinical depression and PTSD, and also help me move forward without this overwhelming feeling of anxiety all the time. So I'm going to start with the side of depression. And the first thing that I recognised that I actually had to do was to heal the past. If depression is all about the past and the events that were causing me an awful lot of pain and guilt and sadness and grief, which they were, I'd lost everything. I'd lost my mum, I'd lost my business, I'd lost my partner, I'd lost my friendship group, I'd lost my home, I'd lost my self-identity, I'd lost my health, I'd lost so much. It was like I had to heal it. You can't fix the past. There's no way of going back in time at the moment to actually unravel all of those things. I had to go and heal it. And to me, through the work that I was doing and how I went off and found these answers, was to heal, you have to feel. You have to feel all of those feelings of guilt, of shame, of discomfort. I had to feel the sadness. I had to feel the regret. I had to feel the hurt. I had to feel the anger. I had to feel all of it in order to be able to heal it. And once I'd healed it, or was on the journey to healing, the second part I had to do was actually just accept that the past was the past. I didn't have to understand it. And this was one of the biggest things I had to work with a therapist with, was that I couldn't actually understand what had happened. How can you understand death? How can you understand how someone can hurt somebody else so badly and not realise that they were going to? How can you? I didn't have to understand it, but I could start to accept it. I can't change it, but I can feel it, and I can heal it, and I can accept it. And when I'd moved into that kind of more peaceful place, I was able to start to move forward. And through this process of healing and accepting, one of the biggest things of mindfulness and the principles of mindfulness that I was learning at the time was to hold myself in compassion and non-judgment. I had to hold myself in absolute compassion for what had happened in the past, for any mistakes or bad choices that I had made. And this was when I started to really connect with my inner child, that little part of me that was grieving, that was so hurt. And again, I worked with another amazing energy healer, and I went on this beautiful journey in one of the hypnotherapy sessions I went on. And I imagined myself literally holding myself as a baby and just pouring words of love and compassion and giving myself all of that self-love and healing and holding myself through that, and that hugely helped me. And in that visualization, I was able to bring that compassion out into the world and into my everyday life, so that I didn't judge myself if I felt like crying, or if I was tired, or if I didn't want to get up. So it was this ability to heal through feeling, of acceptance, of being able to hold myself in compassion for all of it, holding myself as that little child. And then the final piece was all around the forgiveness. When I've been started to cultivate this feeling of peace of the past, rather than living in my past, making peace with the past, I started to be able to do one of the hardest things I've ever been able to have to do, which was to forgive. And it was a quote by Wayne Dyer that really helped me understand forgiveness the most. And I've written it down because I always fumble my words. But he says, Wayne Dyer, if you heard Dr. Wayne Dyer, a wonderful spiritual thought leader, forgiveness is the fragrance the violet sheds on the heel that crushes it. So the violet gives out this wonderful smell despite being crushed by the heel that trod on it. And what I understood about forgiveness was twofold. Number one, it stopped the hostility and anger in me around the people who I had felt had done me wrong. And not having that hostility and anger was liberating. And that second thing, it was that liberation that set me free from resentment. I freed myself from resentment, and I freed them. Didn't condone what they were doing or had done, but I set them free, and in doing so, I set myself free. And through all of this, through the healing, through the acceptance, through the compassion, through the forgiveness, I was able to come back into the moment of love in the moment. I was able to hold myself with love and everybody else around me, and it was in that energy of love I was able to find happiness again, start to feel happy again. And that was a beautiful thing. So that's how you can help yourself with depression at a very, very high level, and the steps that I took myself on. So while I was working on the side of depression, I started to also look at the future, because I had to. I had 2 small children. I needed to look at the future and understand what was going to happen. And the biggest thing I started to learn through the practice of mindfulness and understanding all of the wisdom from Eckhart Tolle and the Power of Now is that we have like 75,000 thoughts a day. That is a lot of thoughts, a lot of fears, a lot of worries, and a lot of doubt that gets tied up and wrapped up in the whole anxiety kind of like feeling. And what I started to recognize that was I was living in my head, and I was using my mind and my imagination to create stories of worst case scenarios of what was going to happen in the future. I was never going to get a job again. I was never going to go find love again. I was never going to be healthy again. I was never going to have a life of love again. I wasn't going to have a home. And I projected myself into that future, and all I could see was a shriveled self, my shriveled self of not being able to cope. And that thought was such a terrifying thought. Terrifying. So I was projecting everything in my mind in this visual onto the future, and it was overwhelming and terrifying at the same time. But what I started to recognize, what these were all just thoughts. And the thought is actually worse than the feeling of when something happened. Because if I took myself back into the past, everything that had just happened, I had at one point in time been frightened of actually happening, of losing my mum, of losing my job and my income and my business failing, of losing my home, of losing my health and my mind, of losing my partner and my one true love. I had feared all of those, and they'd actually all come true in a very short space of time. And I was okay. And this is what I started to recognize, that the thought, the stories that I was telling myself may not ever even happen. And actually, the thought about them was worse than the actual reality of it happening. Because in the moment, I was going to be okay. The feeling of it actually happening, I could cope with. So this is what I did when it came to anxiety. I started to become very, very consciously aware of my thoughts and what I was thinking. And rather than ruminate and go down the rabbit's holes with every single thought and getting myself tangled up into more and more and more anxious thoughts and cycles and stories, I started to write them down and recognize them and see them. And for every worry and every fear and every doubt and every scenario that I was frightened of happening, I started to put a plan together instead. So rather than just worry about them, I started to say, well, if that was to happen, this is what I would do. And it's become one of my greatest tools, the worst case scenario tool. You start to mitigate risk. And this is what I used to do in my first job when I was a consultant. I was always looking out for the worst case scenario and how to mitigate it and what we would do if it would happen. We always had a fail-safe plan. So I started to do that for my life. And in doing so, I knew that I was going to be okay. Because often the thoughts and the stories that I was telling myself were the ones where I thought that I wasn't going to be okay, and that was a terrifying feeling that I was imagining in my body. So if I could write these plans to know that I was going to be okay, I was going to be okay. So that was the first thing that I did. The second thing I started to do was recognise that I wasn't a victim of my current situation, that I could actually be the heroine of my story. I even wrote a blog post about it, so I remember exactly when I did that. And I started to build emotional resilience within myself. I started to recognise, as Iris says in The Holiday, I was the leading lady of my life. I could get myself back up on the horse. I didn't need a man or a job or anything else to get back up on my horse of my life. I could create it. I could write it. I could determine it. I was in charge, not anybody else. And while that was a terrifying thought, because typically in my past, everybody else had decided what I was going to do, now I was in charge. And while it was also frightening, it was also very liberating and also very exciting. So I started to learn, and I used my brain to decide, well, if this is what I'm going to do, if I'm going to take charge of my life and my circumstances and do it for me, what do I need to know? What do I need to learn? And I started to use my brain for other things. Again, rather than worrying and thinking and thought, being trapped in the future fears, I started to take the reins of my life, and I started to learn about emotional resilience. I learned to meditate properly. I learned about mindfulness. The information that I was learning through the Power of Now, I went and did more learning, more courses, took qualifications. I learned how to live my life. I learned and understood how nutrition played on my mind. I learned how the power of food and the connection between the vagus nerve and how you digest food and how it plays with your mind. How did that work? How did lifestyle practices help anxiety and depression? How did that all work? When I was worried about not having any money, I started my own side hustle. I started coaching. I started helping people. People were asking me, how are you doing what you're doing? How are you getting through what you're getting through? Can you teach me how to be happy? Can you share with me? And so I started my own coaching business and helping people on the side. I had money. And this fear of being alone that I had, I decided, well, if I'm frightened of being alone, let me get comfortable with being alone. And I started to spend time on my own and enjoy it. So I was no longer frightened of being alone. I was no longer frightened of the things and the stories that I was playing myself. I would start to learn how to make that a good thing. And then I started in this much more confident place, because now I was aware of my fears. I had my plans for my worst case scenario. I'd started to take control of my mind by learning and feeding it with all of these good things. The last thing that I did was I started to focus on the best case scenario. So while I've been looking at the worst case scenarios and living in the worst case scenarios, I now have plans for those, and I tucked them in a drawer somewhere. And I knew I was going to be okay if that happened. But what I started to do was look at the best case scenarios. And I started to look out, what if everything goes to plan? What if everything works out? What if everything is even better than I had ever imagined? And I started to get ready for the success of that actually happening. I started to play to win, so to speak. Rather than fearing and mitigating every little thing that could go wrong, I started to make plans for everything was going to go right. And that gave me positivity and excitement, and I knew where I was going, and I started to paint a better future in my mind than the one that was causing me anxiety. I started to relinquish control. I started to trust and have faith in something that was bigger, and I started to see that everything could get better and believe more in that and think more about that than the fears and the doubts and the worries. So that is how I started to help myself both with depression and also with anxiety. And if you take one thing away from today, then I would love for you to take away from today is that the most powerful moment is this one right now. And the most powerful person in your life is you. And you are in control of both of those things. This moment, not the past and not the future, not anybody else but you. And this is how you turn yourself from a victim of your past or a victim or a slave to your future into someone who is absolutely magnificent, and you've got this and you know that you can handle it. I knew I had one life, and I did not want to live in this state of depression, of PTSD, of being unhealthy, of not looking after my body. I knew I had one life. My mum had just died. I knew life was finite, and I wanted to make this the best one for me and the best one for my children. I did not want to be staying in this position for the rest of my life. I was only 40 at the time. I didn't want another 4 decades of the same. So I started to build a team and ask for help around me. I worked with energy healers. I worked with coaches. I worked with therapists. I worked with so many different people to help support me through this, and I learned so much. So if you are currently in a state of either overwhelming anxiety or crippling depression, know that there are ways out. And I hope that you take some of the methods that I've just shared with you today and use those. If you need more support, you know where to find me. You can find me in my inbox, you can find me in my email, you can find me on my website. I offer private mentorship. I know where you are and I know how to get out. I've got the tools and the lights, and I can show those to you. I will share everything with you on a deeper level, and we will find your way out. Come and work with me. The offer is always there. For those of you who just want a little bit of an extra tweak, or to do your own work in your own way and do a bit of self-study, then there are some free options that you can take. If you want to dive into healing through feeling, one of the best tools I ever used was the feeling wheel, and I have a little freebie download that you can use. All you need to do is type in the comments below healing, and I will send you the link and you can get that. Another one, if you are feeling hugely overwhelmed about the future, not sure where to start, I also have another amazing workbook to help you unravel all of the possible options that are facing you and help you work through your fears, write those mitigating actions and worst case scenario plans. If that's something that you want to work on, I also have another freebie download. Just type in overwhelm in the bottom and I will send you the link and you can have that. If mindfulness and meditation is something that you would really like to work on and bring in and use as a tool, this was one of my biggest tools. Rather than medication, I used meditation to help me heal from depression and anxiety. It was probably the best thing that I ever did, was to learn how to do this for myself. If that's something that you would like to do, you can come and join me and learn how to meditate properly by joining me every Monday. I have a meditation circle. You have access to all of my meditations I have ever written or recorded, and you'll get a new one every single week. If you'd like that, that's also free. Just type in the comments below meditate, and I will also send you a link for that. If you just want to know more about how you can be happy and what's not working and what is working and what isn't, and you would like your own unique roadmap back to happiness, then I have a happiness report that can help you do that. You just need to answer a few questions in the happiness quiz, and I will send you your report with your unique roadmap on what you can do in your life, your work, your health to support you on that road back to happiness. Just type in happy below and I will send you the link and you can have that. That is also a free offer for you to get that happiness report, and I will send that to you in your inbox. One of the biggest things that helped me lift myself out of a state of depression and anxiety was to learn to dream again, to dream joyful dreams. And the latest joy code that I have just released this month was all about unlocking the power of your dreams, how you can infuse your life through the power of dreaming. I can take myself off into the land of dreams and create this wonderful sense of happiness in the moment right now, without attaching anything to that dream happening or not, just enjoying it for the dream itself. And it was one of the biggest things that I'd forgotten how to do. And sometimes we have to relearn the things that we don't know how to do. And this is how I take you on a transformational journey in how to dream and dream with joy. This is the joy code, and you can get it for £55. It's a 90-minute masterclass workshop with workbooks and materials. And if you would like that, please do just drop me a note, drop me a message below in the comments, type joy, and I will send you the link as well. Thank you for being with me today. I hope that was really useful for those of you who are really struggling at the moment with any form of anxiety, depression, or any kind of mental health disorder. This was for you, and I send it to you with love. Remember, the most powerful moment is this one, right now. the most powerful person in the room is you.